new term this week. I had no idea what it meant. The term is metaverse. Any of you heard of it? Metaverse. Meta means, I knew what meta meant, it means beyond. Mega means big. It's a term that refers to the next phase of the internet, beyond what the internet is now. In fact, if you do a little reading about it, it means sort of the avatar kind of reality where you can move virtually into an environment and be there physically. I don't understand. It's like we could have a Zoom meeting, but we were meeting together and I could reach over and I could tap Bill on the shoulder. Unbelievable. I was thinking about how do these things come about? And in order to get there, as I understand it, coding has to be developed in order to develop the internet and being able to get to those places. I don't know how you code. I know what it means. I know what it means to communicate with a computer. So how do you get to those places? I read back in Genesis chapter 11 about that God's people migrated from the east. They were all of one language. They settled in Shinar and they said to one another, come let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick and stone. They knew how to make mortar. They knew how to stack it. They had architects, builders, engineers, all of that stuff. They were going to build a tower that reached all the way to heaven. The text says, behold, they are one people and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they proposed to do will now be impossible for them. Metaverse impossible? No. Also heard this week that Harvard had elected a new chaplain to be over all the 40 different religious leaders in their system. And he was unanimously elected. He is atheist, not God. He's an atheist. He says, I'm a humanist. Because he believes that it's within the human creation to be able to deal with everything that life is. It's possible within us to produce peace, to produce good, to deal with all the issues of life, to continue on. So you don't need God. That's not believing in God, there's no need. He's atheist. Because as we understand what Scripture says, it is within us through our unbelief to be able to do all that we imagine. Think about that, that's startling and it's confronting. I was talking with a young lady who spent the night with us last night. Emily Paget spent the night with us last night. She's going to BU. And so at the breakfast table this morning, I started having a whole quote with her about some of these things. And she immediately pulled up a couple of articles. She had a couple of authors. And one of the things that she said that is being addressed in some of these areas is the misuse of imagination. I don't like that term, but it's very communicative. Ephesians 3:20 and 21, Paul says that God is able to do far more exceedingly abundantly beyond all that we ask or imagine according to the power that works in us. Now I back off and I say, what power works within us? Is it the power of humanism and the power of my ability and my capacity to do whatever I think and imagine from a humanistic atheo perspective? Or is it God Almighty, the Creator? See, we continue to live in the world, we can't get out of the world. Not gonna do that. That's John 17, 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We live in the world. We have to negotiate it. We have to live in it. So what does that mean? I say all that to say, turn to Ephesians chapter 2. Let's start in verse 11. The title of what we'll study this morning is The Dwelling Place for God Created by the Spirit. You know, the theme of what we'll talk about and study is the Spirit is building this dwelling place for God. This dwelling place for God, the Spirit is building this place, dwelling place for God. My objective is for us to understand that the Spirit is our access to the Father. That's what we'll study in this context. Down at the end of our street, not far from where we live, is an intersection of Route 62 and Route 2. It's a little triangular lot, and there's a dumpy little house. And I'm not sure anybody's ever lived there that I recognize, perhaps, but it's overgrown. It's just this little place in the worst location. Can you imagine living at the intersection of Route 62 and Route 2? I mean, right on it. You know, I can't imagine living there. And all of a sudden, a sign goes up on the side of the house, Habitat for Humanity. This house is going to be transformed into a place to live for someone in the worst possible location. And yet that doesn't seem to matter because it's Habitat for Humanity project. It's kind of exciting to see what's going to happen. You know, God said, my house is going to be destroyed. My tabernacle. The one that Solomon built. Nebuchadnezzar is going to burn it to the ground. Absolutely wipe it out. And be rebuilt. And it too will be destroyed. God had always lived in the Holy of Holies, the Naos, in the Old Testament. But that house is going to be gone, that physical house. It doesn't exist anymore. What's he going to do? Where's he going to live? What's he going to build? Is he going to be at random? Where's his location going to be? So that's what we're going to talk about this morning. And before I start into the text, you know, we've been studying the Spirit for a number of weeks. And my question is, what do you remember about it? Because you have to go back to what we've studied to really understand what we're going to talk about today. Because what we've studied and what we're going to talk about today exists right in the middle of the metaverse, if it comes, or however it comes. See, we've talked about the ministry of the Spirit. We've talked about the Spirit in the fellowship, Spirit of freedom, Spirit of mystery, being led by the Spirit, walking by the Spirit, staying in step with the Spirit, the new birth through the Spirit, living by the Spirit, comforted with the helper of the Spirit that we can grieve or that we can quench. We've been taught about and studied the opposition between humanism, my value, my flesh, and the Spirit. The direct opposition. And we live there in the middle of it. So what significance does God's house hold have to do with it? As a place to live. A place to be in the middle of whatever the imagination of the flesh is doing around us. Does that not provoke us? does that not cause us to sit up and say, come on, God, you've done what we need to have done? That's our study. In verse 11, chapter 2 in Ephesians, the point will be God cannot dwell with the separated. Number 2 will be the building code for God's house. Number 3 will be God's open house. So start with me and we'll read in verse 11 of chapter 2. He's taking back the Ephesians church to where they started. He says, remember that at one point you Gentiles in the flesh called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, which is made in the flesh by hands. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Well, that list after my name, right? He says, you were the not circumcised. And you were identified as such by those who were circumcised. You were labeled. There was a separation. You were identified. You couldn't cross that line. It was us and them. And you were there. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 11, Paul will say that physical act done by physical hands, which alienated and separated, which caused hostility, doesn't exist anymore. There is a new circumcision which establishes covenant with me, and that's baptism. Baptism of the heart. Now that's important because God is going to build a new residence. He's going to live where he always lived, and that is in the Holy of Holies. But this new residence is going to feed the Holy of Holies, the Naos. He says he cannot and will not live with strangers. In verse 13, he says, but now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of two, so making peace. And so there's a building code. He says, I'm going to build my house, and this is what it is. It's going to be established by Christ's blood. See, there's a trail of blood to his house. And that house is not going to have a dividing wall in it. If I went into the dividing walls of the temple and historical pieces of that, you can read that. Point is that in this house, there's no dividing wall among folk, among people. There was a load-bearing wall. You can visualize it. If you take out that load-bearing wall, the thing crashes in. But this load-bearing wall is going to be removed, and there will be a load-bearing beam that creates a space that everybody's in. There's no division in it whatsoever. So now, not two rooms, but there's one. And there's peace because all are one in the house, one room. It's the only place that God will live, and it's a room of reconciliation. Reconciliation basically means killing the hostility. Hostility is to kill. He says in verse 20 that there's a cornerstone on this house, it's Christ himself. It's built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. Across the street from our house, there's an old house. I don't know, it's an old village colonial, probably built in the early 1900s. And people sort of been out, and their young couples move in. They had a couple of children, and they move out because there's no more room in the house for them. And so the last people that moved in turned the thing upside down, literally. The husband that lives there, dad is a contractor. And he moved in, and he did to this house what I would have never thought you could do. One day I was over there talking with him, and he said, "What's this?" And he put this like a bearing on this side of the floor, just put it down, the thing was over about 20 feet, there was a 4-inch drop. You know, that doesn't work. Doors don't shut, windows don't shut. And so he put in a beam, raised it up, leveled it. And then all the inspectors started coming. I mean, there was the building inspector, the plumbing inspector, the electrical inspector, the this inspector, you know, whatever needed to be inspected, these people would begin to show up. And Richie, the dad, the contractor, would be out in front waiting on whoever inspector was coming. And I just thought about in this context, you know, the apostles laid the foundation. We've got that foundation. We know what the building code is. We continue to build on that foundation, and the apostles in their code continue to inspect it. Not in a legalistic way, but things have got to be level. They got to be plumb, or you can't build on. But that's what God is doing. And there's a cornerstone, so everything is going to be plumb and level from that cornerstone. Then the only way he says that you can get into this is through the cross, because it's at the cross where hostility is killed. The hostility between Jew and Gentile. And when he says all are one, the only way you can get into this house is you all get in through the same door. And so verses 22, I just call God's open house. So verse 18, verse 17, it says, he came and preached to you who were far off, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access in one spirit to the Father. I want us to see the consistency of our study of the Spirit over a long period of time. And that is, access is only through the Spirit. Doesn't make any difference how powerful your intellect is, what you figured out, what your imagination is, what you do, what your education is. There's only one access, and that's through the Spirit. So we really need to understand the access, right? That's what Don read. Paul told the Corinthian church, he said, folks, there's a lot of commotion going on within this church. A lot of worldliness, a lot of humanism, a lot of thinking one's better than the other. One has more power, one has better gifts, one has this. You're suing each other, you're going to law against each other, the sexual. He says, let me tell you something. Let's take it right back to where it began. One Spirit. This is Psalm 1, Ephesians 4:4. One Spirit, you are all baptized into one body. You all drank the same Spirit. When that happened, it was level. No more Jew and Greek, slave and free, all one in this room where hostility has been shot and killed. Done. The only way you get in is through the cross. Look at this. Beginning in verse 18, He says, for through him we both have access in one spirit to the Father. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens. I can tell you this. Talking with Emily this morning, her age, her experience, her knowledge, I felt a bit like a stranger. Had to do with technology. And I start thinking about metaverse or those kind of things. I can't even remember whether it was a phone message or a text. And I'm fairly literate. I got to find a place where I can live in this kind of world. So I've got access. John 3:5, John would lay out this for the first time. And Nicodemus says, I'm a bit alienated here, Rabbi. You just said I'm born from above. I can't get back into my mother's womb. What in the world are you talking about? Sounds like something, right? Jesus says, well, that new birth, that birth from above happens by water and spirit. And then he'll go on to talk about the spirit's part in that rebirth. He's laying the groundwork for the access into the house that he's going to build because the old one's gone. What's the new one going to look like? He said, you're the teacher of Israel, and you don't understand these things? Provoked him a bit, I think. Ephesians 4:4, Paul says, there is one body, one spirit. This is you were called in one hope. Belongs to your call. One Lord, one spirit, one baptism. God designed, spirit executed. I keep saying that because when we get down to verse 22, it says, for this chapter 2, verse 22, it says, in whom the whole structure being joined together grows into a naos, a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. That's why we understand and are part of the Spirit's ministry, of the fellowship of the Spirit. We're free in the Spirit. We're led. We're walked. We keep in step. We have a new birth. We live by. We're comforted by the Helper. That's why. That's being an inhabitant. That's being one. That's living without hostility. That's how we live in this world that is being run by the godless world, building on the worth and the value and the immeasurable power of humanism, which is a lie. But that's the pursuit of our faith. You see, we're confronted with unbelief in our own lives, are we not? I'm looking out over an audience of can-do people who have done and will do. God of this world loves that. Because as long as he can keep putting in our heart that we don't need God to do this, no matter how small, then we become unbelievers. We live in a household of belief being built by the Spirit, a household that is freedom, ministry, fellowship. We live in a household that's being led by the Spirit, walking by the Spirit, keeping in step with the Spirit. We live in a household that we've got access through the Spirit by being baptized. See, we got to keep coming back to that, and we can't live in this metaverse. How do you do that? Without turning over to our faith. Unbelief. Does that not make each one of us incredibly grateful, humbled beyond belief, that God has built a house that we are in, able to live in a world that is after us with everything that the God of this world has to fill us? Come on, God. You built the house for us. And that's what he did. As we go on, he says, verse 20, he says, built on the foundation. I'll start back in 19. He says, so then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. House he built is us. It's his household of which we are. And he still lives in the same place. He still lives in the Holy of Holies. He never changed it. Because we are, he says, the house. We're being built into that holy temple. Christ is the cornerstone, the apostles and prophets are the foundation, in whom the whole structure being joined together into a holy temple of the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. So you have to be a member of this household. But Paul will tell Timothy in 1 Timothy 3:15, he'll say, look, I'm giving you instruction, I'm telling you how you need to live in the household of God, which is his church. His directions, that's Spirit-led. That's staying in step with the Spirit. That's walking by the Spirit. That's having freedom in the Spirit to do that very thing in his household. Oh, Father, that changes my whole perspective when I'm feeling alienated and challenged. He says that it's identifiable, it's living inside, not outside. It's living inside and not outside. Come on, isn't that good? So in the tabernacle, you couldn't do that. In the temple, you couldn't do that. If you were Gentile, you could only get in a little way. If you were a woman, you could only get in a little way. Come on in. Verse 21, his house that he built himself was built correctly by his design, and it's growing. We're being built together into the dwelling of God by the Spirit. If we move forward into chapter 3, let's just read this conclusion. Verses 4, starting in verse 14. Paul says, I think this is mine. I bow my knee before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that is according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being. I don't care if you can code or not. so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you being rooted and grounded in love may have strength to comprehend with all the saints the breadth, length, height, and depth. That goes beyond the numbers, whatever that is. And to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. And now let's talk about what you're going to be able to do. What you would be able to accomplish. What's about you can do. Let's talk about the proper use of imagination and not the misuse of imagination. He says, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, I would add to all we dream, to all we imagine, according to the power at work within us. It'll be an interesting discussion with humans, because it is about the power that works within us. Challenging thought. To him be glory in the church, in Christ Jesus, throughout all generations, forever, ever, ever, ever. So be it. Leave it right there. Grab hold of it, don't let go of it. We are the Spirit's ministry. We are His fellowship. The Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. We are led by the Spirit, we walk by the Spirit, we stay in step by the Spirit. He's our comfort, our help. We get out of those bounds, we quench Him, and we breathe. That's going to happen back there. That's going to happen for you. Church said,